The SEC rules want me to disclose what our damages are from extreme weather and what our plans are for future dealing with extreme weather. They say because it's increasing. And then they want us to have detailed accounting for our operations and all the material risk to our business. But what does the SEC know about climate change? And how is that going to help our financial markets? How is that going to help our energy industry? How's that going to help our society?
This is Chris Wright, U.S. Energy Secretary and CEO of Liberty Energy, one of the leading oil field services companies in the United States. Liberty Energy primarily focuses on hydraulic fracturing, or fracking, for the extraction of oil and natural gas. According to Chris, it uses advanced technology to minimize environmental impact and enhance the efficiency of its fracking process.
None of this is driven by regulation. This is just our company wanting to get better and our customers wanting to get better. Lower cost operations by burning natural gas, cleaner operations driven by natural gas, and lower greenhouse gas emissions, all driven by competitive forces in the marketplace, nothing to do with regulation.
Liberty Energy is a publicly traded company, and the Securities and Exchange Commission already mandates a set of complicated and highly specific financial disclosures that they are required to give their shareholders. But in March of 2022, the SEC introduced a rule requiring publicly traded companies to provide new disclosures to shareholders in addition to existing financial reports. Companies must now detail greenhouse gas emissions, environmental targets, and risk management strategies for addressing climate change.
Today, investors increasingly want to understand the climate risk of the companies whose stock they own or might buy. So why am I talking about climate risk? Simple, because investors are.
But the news has not been welcome for many companies, including Liberty Energy. On a broader scale, the rule has divided legal scholars, environmentalists, and business people alike. Will it actually reduce climate change? How might this rule impact companies? And most importantly, does the SEC have the authority to create this rule? The Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, was created in response to the stock market crash of 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression.
I've been walking all day.
Its job? To restore investor confidence and make sure capital markets could function properly, and to prevent a similar financial meltdown from occurring again. Fast forward nearly 100 years later. Does the SEC, an independent federal financial agency, get to write regulations on climate change? According to the SEC, climate change is an environmental threat and also a financial one that requires disclosure. Here's Michael Vandenberg, director of the Climate Change Research Network at Vanderbilt University Law School.
We know from economics that companies have an incentive to externalize the harms of their production. They have an incentive to create pollution that they don't pay the costs of controlling and that are not reflected in the price of their products. And as a result, we have a problem where the emissions that we're benefiting from today will cause 100 or more generations to suffer harms. And yet we don't have to account for those today. The challenge we have is that in many cases the federal government is trailing behind where the American public is in terms of environmental protection. American industry is functioning in a world in which we have global markets. And what we see is there are both public and private governance systems that are demanding disclosure by companies around the world. And to be globally competitive right now, you can't ignore those measures.
Michael Girard, professor of professional practice at Columbia Law School, agrees.
The SEC climate rule essentially requires corporations to publicly disclose what their greenhouse gas emissions are and the financial risks they face. But most of the greenhouse gas emissions come directly or indirectly from the private sector. It's the private sector that extracts oil and gas and coal, that runs power plants, that manufactures motor vehicles. And so the behavior of corporations is essential to looking at the climate problem. Europe has already adopted strong climate disclosure regulations, and those are being phased in over the next several years. And for years, there have been voluntary climate disclosures that many companies have made. And there's a whole variety of unofficial protocols and reporting services that have emerged. but they're all different from each other. They have different definitions and parameters. They're voluntary, they're not enforceable. The SEC rule and the California laws would make these disclosures uniform and mandatory.
But opponents of the rule don't see it this way. A total of 9 lawsuits have been filed against the SEC by various stakeholders, including energy companies, business associations, and several attorneys general. These lawsuits argue that the SEC is stepping far outside the boundaries of its federal mandate with this rule, which not only imposes undue burdens on businesses, but will likely actually hamper efforts to curb climate change. Liberty Energy is one of these litigants.
Climate change is real. It's having impacts. We are increasing greenhouse gas emissions that absorb infrared radiation that are helping warm the planet. The problem is it's hard to stop it because the energy sources that make the world go round today emit these greenhouse gas emissions. But what is the scale of those impacts compared to malnutrition, compared to not having enough energy to clean your own home, to not have enough energy to educate your children, to have motorized transport? 7 billion people consume a fraction of the energy we all consume. And because of that, their life opportunities are dramatically less. They're hand washing their clothes, they're breathing dirty air, they don't have easy access to modern medicine, their kids are all not getting educated, they don't have light when it gets dark at night. Energy matters for everything in your life and for everything in everyone's lives. And everything in life has trade-offs, acknowledged or not. If we produce less oil and gas in the United States, it just means it's going to come from somewhere else. Do you think they have lower greenhouse gas emissions in producing oil and gas in Venezuela or Nigeria or Iraq or Iran than we do in the United States? In fact, we know they're meaningfully higher.
The SEC placed a voluntary stay on the new rule on April 4, 2024, but litigation is still ongoing. The central issue is this: to what extent can federal agencies, which derive their authority from Congress, make rules that significantly change American policy without explicit congressional permission? It turns out, the Supreme Court has been grappling with this precise question for decades. Luke Wake is a lawyer with the Pacific Legal Foundation, a pro bono law firm which is one of the litigants taking the SEC to task over this new rule.
The Supreme Court has always recognized that Congress has to delegate sometimes in order for the executive branch to carry out Congress's goals. But it's a different matter when a delegation gives open-ended powers to the executive branch to just make whatever rules it deems fit. That's when you run into a non-delegation violation.
The non-delegation doctrine is a legal principle that comes from a 1928 Supreme Court decision called J.W. Hampton Jr. and Company versus United States. This decision prevented Congress from handing off its lawmaking powers to executive agencies, stating that if Congress did delegate power, it needed to provide clear guidelines for how that power should be used.
If SEC can get away with taking that language and stretching it elastically to get out all sorts of issues that have nothing to do with the sort of financially relevant information that Congress was clearly concerned about, then that violates the non-delegation doctrine, because at that point, they are free to make law.
This has since given rise to a more restrictive principle called the Major Questions Doctrine, which also draws on precedent set by the Supreme Court in cases like Chevron USA versus Natural Resources Defense Council in 1984 and King versus Burwell in 2015. The Major Questions Doctrine says that federal agencies must have clear permission from Congress when dealing with important issues that could significantly impact the economy or public policy, even if they already have statutory authority to do so. Does the new SEC rule violate the non-delegation and major questions doctrines? Legal experts are split.
My view is that the SEC rule does not violate the major questions doctrine. Since it was enacted in the 1930s, the SEC has been requiring companies to disclose the major financial risks and opportunities that they face, because investors really care about the risk profile of their investments. Climate change is indisputably a major financial risk to many companies, so it fits squarely within the requirements of the securities laws of the 1930s to require companies to disclose this kind of financial risk.
Since 1984, federal agencies have relied on a principle called the Chevron Doctrine. which comes from the Supreme Court case Chevron USA versus Natural Resources Defense Council. This doctrine gave agencies broad leeway to interpret statutes as they saw fit when these statutes might be ambiguous as to how they applied in specific cases. In the 2024 Supreme Court case Loper-Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo, the Supreme Court overruled that doctrine.
Loper-Bright is a sea change, and it ended a 40-year experiment with letting federal agencies decide the scope of their own powers. That never made any sense, because it's always been, in our constitutional system, the role of the courts to decide what the law is. And so, Loper-Bright merely restored us to that proper mode of analysis. When someone calls into question an agency's claim to power, you have to look at the statutory text and decide whether or not the agency is right. It will not let the agency put a thumb on the interpretive scale.
One of the legal tools that was used to support the SEC rule was the idea that the Chevron doctrine meant that the court should defer to the SEC's interpretation of its statute. The courts will now give less deference to the SEC's interpretation, but will still pay some attention to it. So the revocation of the Chevron doctrine somewhat weakens the legal case for the SEC rule, but it by no means wipes it out.
SEC has decided to engage in environmental regulation. They're acting outside of their lane, and that's obviously a problem. This is an agency that was created to regulate financial markets, so what business does it have engaging in environmental regulation?
Congress hasn't passed a single major new environmental law since 1990. So the EPA and all the other federal agencies need to be working with statutes that are 30 or 40 or 50 years old, which makes it very challenging, especially if the courts are going to restrict them to using only laws that very explicitly talk about climate change, which almost none do.
As I understand it, the SEC chair, Gary Gensler, when announcing the new rule, made it clear that the new rule is designed to comply with the Supreme Court's definition of materiality. But because the Supreme Court has narrowed their decisional space, Congress is unlikely to adopt major new pollution control statutes, and that limits their actions.
The Supreme Court defines information as material if there is a substantial likelihood that the disclosure of the admitted fact would have been viewed by the reasonable investor as having significantly altered the total mix of information made available. In other words, companies must disclose how climate change affects their business, but they don't have to disclose all the tiny minutiae of this, which would be highly impractical and expensive. Rather, they only need to disclose the information that a reasonable investor would consider relevant to their financial decision-making. This has been the legal definition of materiality since the TSC Industries versus Northway Supreme Court decision in 1976, and, according to the SEC, it designed its climate rule to comply with this definition.
We're not changing any materiality standards. It's just the Supreme Court classic one about substantial likelihood that a reasonable investor would find it significant to the total mix of information in making an investment decision. Straight from the law of the land, the Supreme Court.
What's the effect of that in an era in which we haven't had a major pollution control statute since 1990? If the partisan divide in Congress is so great that Congress is gridlocked, effectively what that means is there's not a great deal that regulatory agencies can do. And again, my fear in that area is that it will cause delay in a response. The public will not go away on this issue. Climate won't go away on this issue. And so what we will get is a lack of action over the next decade or so.
If the SEC rule is upheld, what could be potential outcomes for the productivity of American corporations, especially in the energy sector? On the other hand, if the Supreme Court finds that the SEC overstepped its authority, would that lead to negative environmental consequences?
So I grew up here in suburban Denver, about 10 miles from where we're sitting. When we moved here in the early 1970s, we had the brown cloud. For 100 days a year, you could not see those mountains from here in Denver due to pollution. So air quality just dramatically worse when I was a kid. And I remember reading, and even in our environmental studies class in junior high, they said, environmental impact is wealth times population. So heck, we want the world population is growing, we're getting wealthier. This is only going to get massively worse. Well, since then, the population of Denver is nearly quadrupled, massively wealthier, massively more cars on the road, massively bigger city, and the air is dramatically cleaner. The pollutants have declined 99% in 50 years, 60 years. That's incredible technology. The answer to most problems of impact is technology and a sober evaluation of trade-offs. And I think the SEC climate rule ultimately will reduce US oil and gas production and displace a little bit more of that production overseas, again raising greenhouse gas emissions. A funny outcome from an SEC climate rule.
There's an old saying that you can't manage what you don't measure. The SEC rule requires measurement and disclosure of the greenhouse gas emissions. That's important not only externally, but also internally, because once companies realize what their emissions are, what the sources are, they're better able to control them. We've seen in other areas, like something called a toxic release inventory, that when companies had to publicly disclose after measuring what their emissions were of various toxic substances, they realized there's something I can do about that. And companies then found ways to reduce their toxic emissions. Our hope is that the same kind of thing will happen here. Additionally, these disclosures are going to become a source of outside pressure. Investors that care about environmental impacts, such as the large pension funds, will put pressure on the companies they invest in to lower their greenhouse gas emissions, and may say they're not going to invest at all in companies that either don't measure and disclose their emissions or have emissions that are much higher than those in other sectors. We are already seeing that the voluntary disclosures that many companies do are having an effect on the way companies manage their energy supply and energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. There will be much more of this with new mandatory laws coming into effect.
If any agency was going to sort of naturally address climate change, one would think it's the Environmental Protection Agency. But of course, EPA only has the authority that Congress has given it, say, under the Clean Air Act. But the Supreme Court has made very clear now in repeated cases that climate change is such a consequential issue that if there's going to be regulation to address climate change, that has to come from Congress, not from an agency. But there is this movement afoot of people who think that if Congress isn't doing what I think Congress ought to do, well, we should just go around Congress and just find a way to get it done. That's a really dangerous proposition. If you go around Congress to get at an issue that you personally think is important, you have to remember you're setting a dangerous precedent and you're eroding the foundations of our democratic system.
What I wish people understood is that the climate threat is serious enough that we can't dismiss the need to act quickly. And the history of inaction by Congress on pollution control statutes since 1990 suggests to me that a major new pollution control statute is not right around the corner when it comes to climate. And so if you're running a company, if one administration insists that the climate is not a problem and pulls us out of the Paris Agreement, and then the next administration comes in, puts us back in the Paris Agreement, and adopts rules. And we could see this swinging pendulum going on for quite a while. Do you respond with each administration as it changes, or do you try to have a long-term perspective? In my view, because the climate problem isn't going away, one of the worst things that American business can do is to be left in a place where it's the high carbon actor as compared to other actors around the world. And so I think to position American business in the best way possible, what we need to do is address the climate problem with our eyes open and use both public and private measures to do that.